So we'll get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Kristin Roebuck's new book, Japan Reborn, Race and Eugenics from Empire to Cold War. My name is Seiji Shirane. I teach Japanese history at City College of New York. I will be moderating this book talk, and Tak Fujitani will be discussing. I'll briefly introduce our speaker today. Kristin Roebuck is assistant professor of Japanese history at Cornell University. Her book just came out this year, and we're very excited to present it. Tak Fujitani obviously needs no introduction. He's emeritus professor at the University of Toronto, author of Splendid Monarchy, Race for Empire, and editor of several other books. And we're excited to have him as discussant. So, Kristin, we'll hand it over to you. Please share your screen and your PowerPoint.
Okay. All right. Can everyone see my screen okay? Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thanks especially to Professor Shirane for organizing this and Professor Fujitani for agreeing to provide some comments. I'm really looking forward to that and also to the Q&A. So I'm here to introduce this book that just was published a couple months ago with Columbia University Press. And this is a book where I focus on the figure, sometimes eulogized and sometimes demonized, of the mixed blood child, or konketsuji. Throughout the book, I attend to the boundary drawing and boundary demolishing politics of sex and reproduction in order to unravel how the imagined community of the Japanese constructed themselves as a multiracial and mixed blood people in a time of imperial expansion, only to rather rapidly reconstruct themselves as a putatively pure race after defeat and loss of empire in World War II. So that's the shortest summary of the book I could possibly give, and I'll spend a little more time unpacking that in the remainder of my remarks. So just to give a sense of the overall structure of the book, I'm sharing here the table of contents. Aside from the introduction and the afterword, there are 6 chapters. The first 2 chapters focus on the imperial era. This is the era where I say the sort of dominant conception of the Japanese empire was of one that was constituted by and supportive of blood mixing and mixed blood family formation. Although there were certainly people who argued strongly that blood mixing was a bad idea, and that's something I dig into in detail in chapter 2. In chapters 3 and 4, I focus on the occupation of Japan, where some pretty dramatic changes in the discourse and practice of blood mixing take place. So chapter 3, I look at the use of eugenic abortion and infanticide to curtail blood mixing in this era of defeat and occupation. In chapter 4, I look at the way discourse forms and look at particular detail at race science and the way race scientists are reformulating their conception of the eugenic and national implications of blood mixing under occupation in a context where they're being censored by foreigners. So look in detail at the censorship apparatus, what can and can't be said under occupation. Chapters 5 and 6, I look at the end of occupation and the construction of US-Japan alliance and the contestation of that alliance in the 1950s and in the Cold War. And Professor Shirane had asked me to speak a little bit about how the book is different from the dissertation. So the most important change, I will say, is that the dissertation, which I'm embarrassed to admit that some people have actually downloaded and read that. So I apologize if any of you are in the room who have looked at that. I am sorry. I hope the book is a whole lot better than the dissertation was. The dissertation really just focused on the post-war era. It starts with defeat. The book does not do that. And I have to thank one of my peer reviewers. It was actually after round 1 of peer review. One of 2 peer reviewers said, you know, if you want to make this argument about how things are changing after 1945, you really need to look more closely at what's happening in the imperial era. So that sent me on a multi-year quest to dig back into the archives and write. The first 2 chapters are the last ones that I wrote, and then kind of revise everything that came after in order to reflect those new findings. So I can answer more questions about how the book is different from the dissertation if people are interested, but that's the biggest, the most significant change. I'll also say I hope I did better with Cold War politics, um, electoral politics after World War II, and some other issues. So in the first roughly 100 pages of my book, I focus on the racial and sexual politics of empire. The idea that the Japanese empire could and indeed should expand by integrating people of putatively foreign bloodlines into Japanese families, whether through intermarriage or through adoption, dates at least as far back as the first Sino-Japanese War and the colonization of Taiwan, and that's where I start chapter 1. Although I proceed pretty quickly to the 1930s, where my story really gets going. So Japan's ability to genealogically assimilate diverse conquered and colonized peoples was in this era frequently held up as Japan's unique strength and its mission in the world, one that set it apart from more pure and therefore less flexible white nations and empires. Indeed, a lot of people justified Japanese, empire of a different kind. The Japanese empire is better than white empires, in part because they said we welcome people of all races into our country and into our family, and that's what makes us better. This empire is just in a way that other empires are not. So particularly between 1931 and 1945, the extraordinary pace and scope of Japanese expansion sparked a massive boom in attention to blood mixing in mass media, among bureaucrats, among race scientists, anthropologists, geneticists, eugenicists, and so forth. And I'm not going to talk in great detail today about the eugenic and race scientific sort of studies that I talk about in the book. I'm happy to dig into that in the Q&A if people want more information. Suffice it to say for now that during this era, blood mixing was widely touted as a eugenic and a political tool for assimilating diverse peoples into the imperial family state, while also breeding a larger and more powerful race of Japanese. So throughout my book, I argue it's through the bodies of mixed blood children and their mothers that the boundaries of the Japanese are drawn and defended. During the imperial era, konketsuji were most often imagined as the offspring of Japanese soldiers advancing into foreign lands and impregnating foreign women. But the fact that most konketsuji born after 1945 were sired by soldiers of enemy armies forever changed the meaning of blood mixing. So defeat, occupation, and post-war alliance building with the erstwhile enemy, the United States, sparked a broad negative reaction against blood mixing and a profound devolution in the social status of the mixed blood child, as well as his Japanese mother. And I'll just note what I'm showing you here is a photograph from one of the race scientific studies that was conducted on mixed blood children after World War II. And what you see is the hand of the Japanese researcher positioning the child's head for the camera. In this instance, they were particularly interested in the shape of his ear. They wanted a good photograph of that because they thought that ear shape represented something interesting, something salient about the genetics of race mixing. So one of the consequences of this devolution of status in the mixed blood child after World War II was the rise of international adoption. And that's part of the story I'm going to focus on today. So as you all know, the occupation of Japan ends in April 1952. One of the things I talk about in the book is how quickly in May of 1952, the reaction against the occupation really erupts in nationwide protests and also in mass media and political debates, some of which focus on konketsuji. And the idea that some people make, this argument very, very explicitly, that konketsuji are sort of embodied evidence that Japan has not actually been liberated from foreign control. In fact, they are the evidence that colonization of Japan is ongoing, and some other name, right? So there are a lot of discussions going on about something called, at the time, the konketsuji mondai, or the mixed blood children crisis. And that crisis was understood to revolve around children who are fathered by foreign soldiers, and the focus is overwhelmingly in this moment on US soldiers who were stationed in Japan during the occupation, but of course, who remain in Japan after the occupation's end under the terms of the US-Japan Security Agreement signed in 1951. So the photograph here on the left that's Yoshida Shigeru. He's in San Francisco. He's the head of the Liberal Party at the time, Prime Minister of Japan, the same day in San Francisco that he signs the multilateral peace treaty that brings the occupation of Japan to an end, he also signs the Anpo Security Agreement that authorizes US troops to stay on. So, in the wake of that, it's either a massive transition from occupation to liberty, or it's occupation by another name, right? Depending on your political point of view at the time. You have an outpouring in the press and in protests and in diet debates of rage and recrimination and dire warnings about the future and the state in which the Allies, and above all the Americans, had left Japan. So the mixed blood children crisis is a part of that story. And as one prominent periodical put it at the time, quote, the konketsuji born from those unhappy relations between US soldiers and Japanese women, are mostly abandoned and end up orphans. In 6.5 years of occupation, 200,000 international orphans have been born. So the number 200,000 and the phrase konketsuji mondai was suddenly on every tongue, in the pages of every periodical, and bandied about in debates on the diet floor. So Japan's governing party, the Liberal Party, was under siege, a target of nationwide outrage for allegedly abetting US soldiers in fathering and abandoning 200,000 children in Japan. Now, at this time, Japanese welfare institutions were already massively overburdened with children who had lost families and homes in the final stages of Japan's lost war. In 1947, the Ministry of Welfare counted 123,511 homeless and orphan children nationwide. That does not count many more children who had been unhoused or lost kin and ended up in the houses of extended family or people in their community, often in pretty dire situations, but they weren't included in this statistic. So the real number is much, much higher. 123,511 was the official count. And yet, in 1953, a different Ministry of Welfare expert speculated in the Diet that of all of the children in Japan's social welfare institutions, konketsuji alone must comprise a staggering 20% or more. Now, that statistic is false. It's wildly inflated, just like the number 200,000 is wildly inflated. So I cite these not to give you the accurate story, but to give you a sense of the degree of anxiety, the degree of recrimination, the degree of sort of crisis consciousness that is forming around konketsuji, and give you a sense of the way statistics are being manipulated by some people who have other objects in mind. So at this time, opposition politicians and mainstream media repeatedly voiced the demand of the Japanese people that the United States, quote, take responsibility for the children it had, quote, left behind. And what most people seem to mean when they demanded in this very common post-war phrase that the United States take responsibility for konketsuji seemed to be that the United States should take konketsuji themselves out of Japan. And some people made that very explicit. So for instance, in February of 1952, just before the occupation ends, Japan's Socialist Party councilor Yamashita Gishin demanded from the Diet floor that all US troops depart Japan. So he demands basically that the Anpo Security Alliance not go into effect. And furthermore, he demanded that US troops, as they leave, take all mixed blood children with them. And lots of other people made similar comments in the Diet or in mass media at the time. Often, Japanese politicians and pundits argued that mass deportation was in mixed blood children's own best interests because they needed to live with, quote, people of their own race. So this is part of the reconstruction of the Japanese who had, in the imperial era, often described themselves as a mixed blood people who were capable of assimilating anybody with any kind of lineage at all, reconstructing themselves as a pure race by sort of invoking a logic of hypodescent. So if you have an American parent, a Black parent, a white parent, a Filipino parent, or what have you, you are therefore ipso facto not a member of the Japanese race or the Japanese nation. In short, konketsuji's racial bonds with other Japanese and their bonds with their Japanese mothers were routinely and categorically denied. So it probably won't surprise you to hear that the United States never contemplated effecting the mass removal of mixed blood children from Japan. Such a scheme, I think, sounds implausible, right? Unlikely on the face of it. So legally problematic, that it's hard to resist the conclusion that a lot of these Japanese calls for mass relocation of konketsuji were not really serious policy proposals that were designed to solve a putative crisis in child welfare. They were rhetorical feints that were aimed at embarrassing the United States and its friends in Japan, above all the Liberal Party, which had signed the Anpo Treaty keeping US soldiers in place. And some people very explicitly are trying to discredit that alliance and elevate politicians who are more hostile to the United States, more sympathetic to its rivals in the Cold War. So if you're reading diet transcripts from the 1950s where people are talking about blood mixing, it's socialists who are most frequently using konketsuji as ammunition against the Liberal Party and its most famous policy, which is the US Security Alliance. It is not, however, socialists who start this trend. It's the Japan Communist Party as of 1950. And this is one of the things I don't talk about at all in the dissertation. This is stuff I figured out while I was writing the book. So I talk about the JCP's sort of role in fomenting a sense of crisis about konketsuji, although they kind of, they lose a whole lot of electoral power. So they end up dropping out of the diet debates because the voters don't particularly like them, and the socialists end up taking the lead. Meanwhile, although they're not as numerous or as relentless as opposition politicians on the left, you also have conservative independents or members of the right-wing Democratic Party who also use konketsuji to embarrass the party in power. Including, for example, one of the cases that I talk about is future Prime Minister Nakasone Yasuhiro, who makes some really remarkable comments in the diet about how Yoshida Shigeru and his allies have basically abetted the United States in the financial and biological colonization of Japan, and specifically criticizes Anpo on the basis that it abets the mass production of konketsuji. So, the US-Japan alliance did not crumble under this rhetorical assault, but strain and embarrassment were certainly keenly felt on both sides of the Pacific. US media began covering the story as early as 1948, and by the 1950s, US church groups, journalists, diplomats, and legislators had all taken a lively interest in Japan's so-called mixed-blood children problem. Neither American officials nor the American public were particularly willing to entertain the solution most ardently invoked in Japan, namely the removal of all US troops, along with all the children that they were blamed for siring. But Japanese reports did convince US audiences that the crisis was real, and that it was the United States' responsibility to solve that crisis. Otherwise, the security alliance with Japan, which was the US's key Cold War outpost in Asia, might crumble. So I've been showing you for the last few slides just a few examples of many, many, many US news reports on this issue. This last one, I will just point out at the top left, the woman photographed here, shown in the Washington Post, that's Sawada Miki, who is the source of a huge amount of the information and misinformation that is being published both in Japan and overseas. And I'm going to talk more about the role she plays in a couple of minutes in developing both a sense that there is a crisis and then a very particular solution to that crisis. So amid this outpouring of anxiety and recrimination, in October of 1953, a congressional subcommittee arrived in Tokyo to survey the scene and formulate a response. U.S. Consul General James Pilcher gave the subcommittee a detailed briefing in which he complained of the, quote, misinformation and, quote, grossly exaggerated rhetoric that were distorting the United States' image in Japan. For one thing, he said there were nowhere near 200,000 mixed-blood children orphaned by US fathers in Japan. Japan's Ministry of Welfare conducted multiple nationwide surveys and came up with a number under 500. But that number never circulated as widely as did the more sensational figures, not in Japan and not overseas. Regardless of the actual numbers, Pilcher noted, quote, the Japanese people would probably like to see most of those babies adopted by Americans. And so the United States stumbled toward international adoption as its own preferred solution to the konketsuji crisis. In lieu of mass removal, it would be case-by-case removal. And to the chagrin of US policymakers, case-by-case removal was never enough to satisfy America's critics in Japan. But international adoption could satisfy American audiences that the United States was living up to its responsibilities, exhibiting moral leadership, and doing something to save what the Los Angeles Times called Japan's unwanted. International adoption was a novel concept at the time, and it took years of policy innovation and private experimentation to figure out how it would work. And one key moment came with passage in 1952 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. The INA repealed the racist bar, on Japanese immigration and naturalization that had been in force since 1924. Repeal of that old racist provision in US law was an important plank in the platform of trans-Pacific rapprochement. And reconciliation with all possible allies felt urgently necessary at the time, in the wake of the fall of China, North Korea, and Eastern Europe to communism. Now, the INA set a very low quota. 185 people per year were eligible under the INA to immigrate to the United States. But the INA also set out the expectation that there's this thing called non-quota immigration, and most immigrants, it turned out, would come in under non-quota status. And in that law and in subsequent legislation, orphans, international adoption becomes one of the major mechanisms for getting people in outside the quota system. So while Americans are continuing to debate how much farther to liberalize immigration as a whole, Congress was kept very busy fashioning all kinds of exceptions to the barriers to immigration that remained on the books in the legislation they had just passed. By September of 1953, Congress had passed 349 private bills to grant visas to Japanese nationals who were otherwise ineligible to immigrate, and most of those visas went to orphans. There were many more such private bills to come. A rising tide of public pressure in support of international adoption and legislative exhaustion around passing so many private bills eventually led Congress in 1953 to pass two public laws providing visas for foreign orphans on a large scale. The first, Public Law 162, allocated 500 visas for foreign orphans to be adopted by US military or government personnel who were stationed overseas. Within 3 months, more than half of those slots were claimed by US public servants in Japan. And Pilcher expected almost all of them. At the time he's reporting on this to the subcommittee in Tokyo, he expects basically all of those visas to be used up in Japan. The next act passed in 1953 was the Refugee Relief Act, which provided a further 4,000 visas for foreign orphans. So many of you will be familiar, I think, with a lot of the scholarly literature that has been published on international adoption, including Yuri Dulin's recent prize-winning book. This scholarly literature overwhelmingly positions Korea and the post-Korean War environment from 1953 onward as the origin point for international adoption. Public Law 162, for example, has repeatedly been mischaracterized as designed to facilitate adoption out of Korea. But in fact, almost all adoptees under that law were from Japan and 0 were from Korea. Adoption from Korea did commence under the subsequent RRA, but adoptees from Japan and Okinawa still outnumbered them by 3 to 1. Now, the reason for this dramatic skew is not necessarily that the United States was putting Japan's orphans at the front of the line. There's nothing in the bills that skewed it that way. It's more about push factors coming from Japan. Japan itself was very eager in their early 1950s onwards to send children overseas, at least if those children had mixed blood. So it's really not until the 1960s that Korea took the lead as the sending nation of international adoptees. So in contrast to the old bilateral model, I argue that international adoption was a trilateral mechanism designed to manage the biopolitical tension of alliance building between the United States, post-colonial Korea, and post-imperial Japan. The latter countries were in the process of redefining themselves in the wake of the collapse of the mixed-blood Japanese empire as racially pure. International adoption mediated between the reality that mixture was ongoing under Cold War alliances or neocolonialism, depending again on your point of view, with the United States, and the racial nationalist backlash against that fact in both South Korea and in Japan. No one played a larger role in promoting international adoption as the preferred solution to the Konketsuji crisis than did Japanese Christian philanthropist Sawada Miki, pictured here. As a Mitsubishi heiress and wife of one of Japan's senior diplomats, Sawada Renzo, Miki had wealth, confidence, political connections, and savvy. And in 1948, she leveraged those considerable assets to found the Elizabeth Saunders Home, a segregated facility for mixed blood children. And in this context, when I say segregated, I mean that mixed blood children were segregated from pure children, not, pure children, but all of the different kinds of konketsuji. So you might have a Korean and a Japanese set of parents, and that's considered mixed blood. Or you might have a white American and a Japanese set of parents. That's considered mixed blood. A Black American and a Japanese parent, a Filipino and a Japanese parent. All of those children are considered mixed blood, and all of them are kind of lumped together in this home. From the late 1940s to the 1970s, Sawada Miki organized international letter writing and fundraising campaigns. She sat for interviews in multiple languages in print, radio, and television. She wrote 3 books and countless articles, traveled the world giving speeches, offered advice and expert testimony to leaders of both the Japanese and the United States government. And she invited to her home for mixed blood children innumerable scholars, sightseers, photographers, movie crews, politicians, and bureaucrats, and Japan's imperial family. In the process, Sawada established herself as a household name in Japan. Many people still know her today, and the world's leading authority on mixed blood children and their care. People have likened her to a Japanese Mother Teresa, and they have claimed that she deserved the Nobel Prize. Although neither sainthood nor the Nobel Prize were forthcoming, Sawada Miki has been sanctified in other ways, with domestic honors, international awards, and hagiographic depictions in print and television, and now in digital media. Today, I want to complicate that saintly image by reintroducing some of the facts that get smoothed out of the dominant narrative of Sawada Miki's heroic efforts to solve the konketsuji crisis. So, Sawada's first book was published in 1953, and it contains the following anecdote. A Japanese woman and her son appeared at the Saunders home with an infant in their arms. Neither was the parent of that infant, and neither had the legal right to dispose of it. They gave their reasons for wishing to dispose of it as follows. The infant had been born to the woman's daughter. It was a konketsuji. They, quote, don't need it, and the neighbors don't like it. Sawada took the infant and followed the legal procedures appropriate for an abandoned child, creating a new household registry, household of one, and assigning the infant a new name, thereby erasing its original identity. Shortly thereafter, the infant's young mother, having learned from her family what they had done with her child, arrived at the Saunders home to reclaim her baby. And Sawada turned the mother away. A few days later, the mother came back with a khaki-clad soldier and asked for her baby once again. And at this, Sawada erupted, berating the young woman, demanding that she, quote, learn shame, and refusing to return the baby. Instead, Sawada threatened to involve the police. As she explained to the mother, quote, if you say it's your own child, you'll be detained for abandonment. If you want it at all costs, file a civil suit after you've taken your punishment. So, this threat was levied against a naive young girl with no family to support her and no ready access to legal counsel. It was levied by a matron born into Japan's wealthiest non-royal family, whose social calendar included birthdays with the emperor, tea with the prime minister, dinner with the Rockefellers, and dancing at Buckingham Palace. So the differential in power between the two women was vast, and so too was the differential in each woman's moral standing in the eyes of Japanese society. Because mothers of konketsuji were widely despised as panpan, as whores, who slept with the enemy. This was uneven combat, and Sawada was playing to win. Her threat had its intended effect. The young mother desisted, and her child became an orphan. So the actions that Sawada so proudly described were baldly duplicitous and plainly illegal. But she recounted the tale in public in the expectation that her readers would approve, And for the most part, it appears that they did. Sawada liked to describe all mixed blood children as children, quote, who were born uninvited and unloved. But her own accounts of her interactions with their mothers provide ample evidence that many mothers did want those children and did love them. So Sawada Miki was never a passive recipient of needy orphans. She took orphans when she could get them, but she also created orphans whenever she saw the need, and she saw the need whenever she saw a konketsuji. Sawada fought many a Japanese mother for custody of her child. That she did so in the limelight and was hailed as a hero for doing it speaks volumes about the triumph of racial nationalism over biosocial kinship in Japan after World War II. At a time when leading publications and politicians were advocating the mass removal of konketsuji, Sawada's segregated Saunders home provided a smaller scale venue for excising these children from Japanese kinship and country. By her own account of her confrontation with U.S. Colonel Crawford Sams in 1948, Sawada was perhaps the first person to demand that the United States unilaterally remove all mixed blood children from Japan by military fight. The nullification of matrilineal bonds with konketsuji was more an advantage than a drawback to that plan. Now, under Japanese law, mothers who entrusted their children to a facility like the Saunders home did maintain parental rights, including the right to visit, the right to reclaim the child, and the right to approve or disapprove any potential adoption. Sawada Miki did her utmost to discourage or bar Japanese mothers from exercising those rights. In ways large and small, she interfered with any effort to maintain a familial bond. She insisted that her wards call her mama and that they be told, quote, absolutely nothing about their mothers or fathers. In 1951, she published a long list of complaints about mothers who interfered with her efforts by doing things like visiting their children, providing gifts, toys, or food, or worst of all, taking their children home to live again. In 1952, Sawada instituted a strict no visitation policy. This was, again, in contravention of the law and of the norms applied to pure blood children in Japan. I should also note that Sawada did not permit Japanese people to adopt her mixed blood wards, nor did she permit her mixed blood wards to attend school or socialize with pure blood children. And there were some incidents she reported where they attempted to do so, where these children actually managed to sort of sneak out and form friendships with quote unquote pure children outside the walls of the home. And when she discovered it, she punished it and she broke those friendships, those relationships up. So in every way she could, Sawada set konketsuji apart. And she prepared them with English lessons, baptisms, and steady solicitations to foreigners to be adopted by families across the Pacific. Sawada justified those efforts to both domestic and foreign audiences with the claim that segregating konketsuji was necessary to shield them from prejudice, although prejudice was certainly operating strongly within the walls of the home. It's worth noting that Sawada and her Japanese allies singled out konketsuji with Black American fathers as particularly dysgenic and inassimilable. And I should add that the overwhelming kind of majority of eugenic and race scientific studies that are conducted on konketsuji after World War II are conducted on children in the home. Sawada is providing these children as test materials to eugenicists. So she's particularly adamant, as are some other members of her board and sort of public intellectuals leading the charge to get these children out of Japan, that Black children in particular can't be allowed to remain. The reality is, however, that Black konketsuji sent to the United States would suffer the dual stigma of Jap and of Jim Crow at a time when in Japan, segregation and discrimination in public schools and services were already unconstitutional. And in the face of considerable criticism, the Liberal Party had rejected segregation as a valid policy measure, insisting on racial integration and equality for konketsuji. So the proposition that in the 1950s, Japan was in some ways a more hospitable environment for Black children or mixed blood children than the United States was not something that advocates of international adoption on either side of the Pacific were eager to contemplate. In its quest for Cold War alliances, the United States was struggling to distance itself from an image of unrepentant racism. U.S. abuse and oppression of non-whites was a frequent topic of condemnation in Japanese politics and presses from the imperial era on up into the Cold War. They were also a frequent topic of discussion and condemnation in second and third world presses worldwide. Sawada Miki herself often raised the issue, condemning discriminatory U.S. immigration controls, bewailing her own experience in the pre-war era of segregated housing in New York City, and so on. And yet, despite all this, Sawada advocated sending Konketsuji, quote, to America where there is little racial prejudice, end quote. And she promoted, quote, adoption by compassionate people of the same race as especially appropriate for Konketsuji with African American paternity, again denying that they could possibly be members of the Japanese race. Sawada was, I think, uniquely effective in manipulating and managing the so-called crisis of Konketsuji because she was able to navigate not only Japanese rancor, but also American guilt. Her message was singular, but it cut in different ways depending on her national audience. In Japan, her message encouraged intolerance for race mixing and the segregation and expulsion of an increasingly stigmatized racial minority. In the United States, her message paradoxically encouraged a burgeoning tolerance for race mixing and the integration of a racial minority that an increasing number of Americans seemed to agree should not be stigmatized at all. When US citizens and policymakers, prodded by Sawada, the Konketsuji crisis, the Cold War, and their own conscience, began to embrace international orphans. That embrace spelled the beginning of the end of the US tradition of statutory racial segregation, racial bars to immigration, and criminalization of interracial sex and family formation. Now, miscegenation had never been a crime in Japan, but it was judged as one in the court of public opinion after World War II, when mixed-blood children were made fodder for the Tangitsu Minzoku Shinwa, the dream of a monoracial nation. Those same orphans were, in the United States, fodder for the dream of a race-blind society where any child of any color could be raised in loved in any family, educated equally, and so forth. 70 years later, on both sides of the Pacific, we just keep dreaming. So I'm going to wrap up my comments here. I'm really eager to hear from Professor Fujitani and also from all of the rest of you about your questions. And I think I'll stop screen sharing so we can look at each other's faces.
Yeah, Professor Fujitani, if you can unmute yourself and then.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Seiji, and whoever else was involved in asking me to start the discussion of Kristin's really terrific book. I've really learned so much from it and appreciate the opportunity to talk about it, to learn more from Kristin, as well as hopefully others in the audience who might take part in the discussion. Kristin has already done a really great job of pointing out, or summarizing the main arguments in the book. So, but what I want to do is to highlight some of those arguments that I think are important overall, but also some that maybe struck me as more important than even Kristin mentioned. I don't want to repeat everything that she said already, but anyway, let me get started. I want to also raise a few questions and add a few things of my own. But first of all, I think that the method of getting at this really slippery topic of race and racism through the discourse of mixed blood, and particularly the mixed blood child, the Konketsuji, is really very smart and effective. It could have been a book about race overall, but in a sense, the topic is so overwhelming, and this gives a really kind of a sharp point of entry into discussions, and I think is very effective. And the book is also very, I think, clearly argued, and um, makes for ease of following for any reader who might be interested in this topic. So, of course, we know that since the mid 1990s or so, several scholars have discussed the mixed race issue, beginning with Oguma Eiji in his book on the Tain's Minzoku no Shinwa, in which he pointed out that the transition from the idea of mixed race to pure race happened in the reverse order of what we usually imagine or what we have imagined, usually thinking from homogeneous Yamato race purity to maybe mixed race openness in the post-war, but actually the opposite is what happened. And so Oguma makes this point, and I think it was kind of an epic making turn that some of others have also joined in around that time or somewhat later. So, Christian acknowledges Oguma's contribution, but I think goes beyond it in several different ways. First of all, nuancing the argument, focusing on the discourse of blood in what we might think of as the long 20th century. In other words, it takes a very long history point of view to take off basically from Oguma's original insight and then do a lot more with it to take us up to the present and to complicate things in important ways and also in ways that are politically and ethically, I think, really important in the work, including on the adoption metaphor and so forth that Kristen has talked about. Um, the intervention into blood, I think, is also really important because for me, the discourse of blood has become a kind of root metaphor for racism, racist sensibilities in Japan. Um, the assumption that blood matters, literally, in understanding families, individual capabilities, racial qualities, and so forth, I think is part of what Pierre Bourdieu and actually Tosaka Jun much earlier talked about as common sense or doxa, that these are the kind of assumption that we have, a naturalized assumption of the importance of blood, but which requires no explanation whatsoever. And Totaka's term, by the way, was joshiki, common sense, but it goes back to the original Greek notion of doxa. So, Kristen's book, Once and for All, helps us to get beyond John Dower's War Without Mercy, which still seems to me to be the go-to book for many people who want to talk about Japanese concepts of race in the pre-war and wartime period. But of course, he mistakenly argued that the Japanese Empire prohibited intermarriage, which Kristen shows is absolutely not the case, and that the racial sensibility of that time was that of the Yamato pure race. In fact, that logic existed, but was forced to go underground in places like the Ministry of Welfare that also Kristen talks about. And I want to say something about a little bit more in a moment. I say this while acknowledging the importance of Dower's book in opening up a sort of transnational conversation over race, and also the importance of his work in having us of preventing Americans and others from taking a kind of holier than thou stance regarding the issue of race. So race is on both sides, but of course, he didn't take into account the Asian context of the new racialization, new ideas of race that Oguma and Kristen and some others have taken up. So my first question has to do with an even longer history of blood and blood mixing, and is probably unanswerable. But ask this question again just because I think we might want to think about it. I've been trying to catch up on my reading in Tokugawa early modern period as well, and so I say this even though I acknowledge that it's sort of beyond Kristen's focus and also may not be the most important question to ask, but I'm curious about it because there is a kind of scholarship that says that there was some kind of understanding of racial, blood in racial thinking in the Tokugawa period. And I've been reading this scholar Arano, who tries to make the argument that in the late 16th into the early part of the 17th century, there was a lot of mixing of different peoples, Europeans, British, Koreans, Chinese, and so on in that period. And then the exclusion laws, which included the expelling of what he thinks of as mixed race children, is part of a beginning of the Tainsuminzoku idea, which I don't really buy that because I don't think he really shows that it's blood. But still, the question is really what was the logic of inheritance in the Tokugawa period that then became the inheritance of blood? Because we know that at least among some people there was a preference for succession through children who were produced through sexual relations, what we would think of as a biological relation. So, for example, the imperial household, as far as I know, never resorted to adoption outside of what we would think of as a bloodline, but whether they recognize it as a bloodline, I'm not sure. There was, ease, I won't say ease, but there was ability to succeed through the female line. That's not an issue. But there was a preference for some kind of hereditary succession, uh, even though we know that overall, there was uh, Japanese were much more lax about issues of adoption. So I don't know. It may have been just the elite of that period who took into consideration some of this logic. I'm not sure. So um, my question is, when and how did the discourse of blood begin to circulate in Japan, and if there ever was one prior to the Tokugawa period? Because my sense is that it's probably around the mid 1870s to 1880s that this became the discourse of blood and mixing and all the rest became a part of public discourse. And Fukuzawa Yukichi, for example, wrote his piece called Kettoron on blood lineage I think it's 1875, something like that. Um, so that's, one set of questions. Um, a second important contribution that I don't think Kristin mentioned, but is really important for me for the pre-war period, is that although there was this sort of affirmation of intermarriage and acceptance of so-called konketsuji in the imperial period, she shows that in the late wartime period there was a big exception regarding the Han people, the Han ethnic group or the Han race, that there were people like Nagai Hisomu who argued that intermarriage with the Han people should be prohibited because the somehow there was a power of the Han race, the Han blood, to overwhelm the blood of others, so it would lead to some sort of race suicide, is what his point was. So I wasn't, aware of that and learned much from it. Um, but my second question concerns the Han exception, and that is, um, what about colonial Taiwan and Manchukuo and the harmony of the five races, as well as the allied Wang Jingwei regime, collaborationist regime, that must have caused some discordance or contradictions. I don't know. Maybe people just live with these kind of contradictions as we do. Um, but I think this might be an interesting thing to think about, and whether it's um, only about blood or there's other kinds of factors involved, like sharing common culture, civilization, and so forth that happened with regard to Chinese. Um, but another point that I was going to mention that I think is really quite important as well is I think this discourse shows that as she puts it somewhere, I think, I don't have the exact quote, but that it is the violence that actually creates racism and not always the racism that exists that creates violence. So it's a kind of mutually constitutive relationship. There's a way in which we tend to racialize, our enemies or terrorists. Um, uh, Once the violence begins, of course, there's something that is a basis for that, but the racism takes really hold from the beginning of the violence. Um, so moving to the post-war period, um, so she's very good, I think, in showing how there is this sudden conversion or transformation in the understanding of mixed blood, mixed race, and that this is touched off by a kind of race panic of mixing that is a political kind of relationship that comes with the fear of anxiety of military violence by Russians, Americans, and others in the occupying forces. There is a kind of race panic based upon this occupation and fleeing actually from the Russians on the continent. And then Kristin ties this into the passage of the Eugenic Protection Law of 1948. And I had, some sense of this prior to reading the book, but I think several secondary arguments are worth highlighting. One is she shows how that discourse that was kind of contained more or less within the Ministry of Welfare against miscegenation then was allowed to flourish in the post-war period, including Ministry of Welfare officials such as Koya Yoshio. So that level of detail is really quite interesting to me. Also, I think the important point that she went over a bit, which is that there is a kind of alliance on anti-miscegenation and blood purity that crosses over political ideologies include. So, as she puts it, um, it was young communist students on the left, young Nakasone on the right, mature socialists such as Yamashita, purged feminists such as Ichikawa. All of them converged to stoke moral outrage over blood mixing. So I think this is really important, and it's a way in which I think um, a kind of this naturalization takes place, common sense takes place across these political lines, and we can find that in places like the United States, Canada as well, I would say. Um, Also importantly, I think she makes the important observation that the anxiety about blood mixing became primarily about the United States and the American forces, and that this actually contributed to the forgetting of the whole discourse on um, blood mixing with Asians, other Asian people in the pre-war, wartime period. Um, so I don't want to go too much longer. Okay, so a fourth really important contribution that Kristin really talked about at some length is that of the Elizabeth Saunders Home for the so-called Konketsuji orphans, and the role of Sawada Miki. So I have to admit I don't know much about the Saunders Home. I knew about it, but I don't really know much about it. So all the detail was very illuminating for me. And Kristen talks about the ways in which Sawada Miki, as well as others around her, became complicit in what she calls, to quote, ethnic cleansing. So, ethnic cleansing, those are pretty strong words, but I think really quite appropriate um, for the situation that she describes, um, uh, because Sawada Miki's, it is about the Sanders home, but the way that Kristen describes it, it's about the much a broader trans-Pacific context of the ways in which this discourse on Japanese purity took place in relation to the United States, Cold War United States, and the need for the United States to appear to be more um, welcoming of different races, the disavowal of racism that takes place in the Cold War era against really charges against American racism by the Soviet Union and others. So she makes it really very, very clear that any kind of um, laudatory narrative about Sawada as a kind of savior for these mixed race children completely occludes the fact that she participated in this kind of racist viewpoint toward the so-called mixed race children, that she was, the positive story of saving these so-called, pitiful babies and so forth needs to be rethought. That instead of that exporting these babies, more effort should have been made to create a social situation in which they could thrive within the context of Japan. And I also appreciated that uh, Kristin talked about several people who were of so-called mixed race from the pre-war period, Egawa Ureo and Hirano Imao, and how they actually were trying to do that work of finding a place in a multi-ethnic, multi-racial Japan. Also, and I'll just mention this briefly because Kristen already talked about it. She wants to query why it is that there's so much belief that in transnational adoption really originated with the Korean War and Korean adoption, when in fact there's an earlier prehistory to that. Okay, so I'm not sure if I'm allowed to keep going. I think I have gone a little bit over 15, yeah, but just a little bit more. Um, So the larger question, I think, that comes from just talking about mixed race uh, with regard to the Sanders home, but through the whole book, is how do we rename these categories? How do we rename konketsuji or terms such as hafu so as not to reproduce the myth of race? Uh, Clearly, Kristin is aware of this problem, and yet I still find myself puzzled by what to do about it myself. I want to hear more about what others might think of how to deal with this issue. We can always talk about, how they are represented to do that, but then when we talk about it, how would we do that? Because it is true that there are effects of the racialization of these people that then creates a discourse on the mixing. Um, these are strange words, like half black. Half black connotes there's a whole black, and also it adds to it a kind of strange idea of race quantum. How do we avoid these kinds of terms? Um, the last point, I'll try to be brief about it, although I wrote quite a few notes on it, and that it has to do with the emperor and the place of the emperor in this discourse on race. So Kristen argues that there was a shift from loyalty to the emperor as criterion for becoming Japanese. This may be a little bit of an overstatement, but I would agree with it, along with some caveats. Transformation and from that, and then in the emperor, and then in the post-war period, the emperor needed to take a few steps back is the literal quote. Um, I agree that the emperor, as symbol of the nation, may have taken a few steps back from his presence at the apex of the nation prior to 1945. But it's also important to realize that the imperial family continues to be entangled in the broader discourse on Japanese blood. That was an argument popularized by Eto Jun and Ichimura Shinichi in the 1980s. Um, the main argument being that the Japanese imperial household is is made up of the same minzoku as the Japanese people. They said that this was distinctive because European royalty are not of the same minsoku as their subjects. There was a lot of intermarriage between courts, in other words, in Europe, while Japanese were endogamous, so to speak, the within Japan. And so, because of that, in Europe, there's a gap between the kokumin and then the royalty. Um, this is this kind of thinking has been taken up by many people, including the right-wing nationalist Kobayashi Yoshinori, who wrote on the emperor as symbol of Japanese minzoku and the carrier of Japanese blood. And I'll just end by saying that I've been reading the transcripts of the 2004 2021 meetings of the two advisory councils that were established to deliberate on rules for imperial succession. So, because of this crisis on imperial succession that gets much talked about as female succession or not, there were the two councils established, Yushiki Sha Kaigi, they're called. So most commentators consider this a matter of gender politics, whether women can succeed the throne or whether children can succeed the throne through the female line. But my point is really that the underlying assumption that any successor must share the blood. So, the first council's final report stated explicitly in its list of terms that the ambiguous term, blood ambiguous term, koto, imperial lineage, means ketto, blood lineage. That's, because terms that are used, such as in the Constitution and imperial household law, sesshu, by hereditary succession, doesn't necessarily have to mean blood. But here it's very much clarified. The report also emphasized that people expected succession to be determined by, quote, primacy of the natural bloodline. So it didn't matter whether so many of the participants in these council meetings were for or against female imperial succession. They all agreed, except for one person, uh, all agreed that succession should be limited to the blood time. So I mentioned this importance of the imperial household in Japan's blood nationalism because it resonates so well with all that Kristin has really written. It shows again the importance and the ubiquity of this discourse on race, on blood as a kind of anchor for race. So I want to end with the following question for the Japanese people, but also for other royalty and other royalties in other places that depend upon this blood relation for succession. That would be, do the Japanese people generally wish to have their state and the unity of the people represented by a symbol that is anchored in the symbolism of blood? So I'll end there and wait for feedback and some more questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that. So just a housekeeping manner, we will stop recording for the Q&A. Please start to think of your questions, raise your digital hand or type questions into the group chat. I think for Kristin to address these 6 questions would take probably more than an hour. If she wants to, if you would like to maybe address two of them or a few minutes, that would be great. And then you can probably answer some of the questions that are related that'll come up in the Q&A. So Kristin, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Really wonderful comments and questions. So maybe I'll start at the end with the emperor, right? I would not want to overemphasize the idea that I say the emperor has to take some steps back. I do not mean that he becomes irrelevant, right, to Japanese identity or nationalism. I think the extent of his relevance depends in part on some of the ideological differences that we're used to thinking about, and that I'm trying in some ways in my books to say that the right and the left actually have a lot in common in the way they conceptualize identity after World War II through the blood. And I think you're absolutely right to say, well, for some people, the emperor remains a way of defining the blood and is defined by bloodline. One of the really interesting things about this, though, is that in the imperial era where I start my book, people also said that, right? That they're trying to think about how the Minzoku relates to the empire, and the idea that there's some commonality in the way Minzoku forms and the way the imperial family has intermarried with so many conquered peoples and taken so many conquered women into it in order to sort of produce that bloodline over the centuries is held out as the model for the Japanese empire to follow in modern times, right, in the conquest of new lands. So it used to be in the imperial era kind of common sense that the imperial family was of mixed blood. And so there's something radically different about what's happening in the 1980s if people are now saying, well, the Japanese bloodline is pure at the level of the Minzoku and also pure at the level of the imperial family. That entails a kind of forgetting of empire and of the longue durée of Japanese history. So I guess your first two questions are amazing research projects that perhaps would take another 10 to 15 years for me to work out answers to. And I did for a long time think that my second book project would be question one. In this even longer history of blood, where does this idea of blood come from? And what was going on in the Tokugawa era, and how are, ideas of heredity from the Tokugawa era transformed or continued into the Meiji. But I don't want to do that. I actually want to work on other problems for a while. So I don't know that I'll have the answer to that. Like you, I'm sort of tempted to think that there are longer continuities, but that there's also something distinctive that starts happening around the 1870s with the importation, among other things, of a lot of new ideas, right? And people like Fukuzawa Yukichi are at the forefront of translating and mediating some of those ideas in debates about konketsu. And questions of what it means for terms like, neologisms like Minzoku. What does it mean to think of Japan as being a Minzoku? One of the only kind of hints I will suggest that I always intended to follow up on, and if anyone else wants to explain this to me now or in several years' time, I would love this. I think it is significant that some of the early uses of Minzoku were referring to status groups from the Tokugawa era. So, like the samurai were a separate Minzoku. It was not assumed initially in the early Meiji era that everybody in Japan was part of a single Minzoku. It takes some time to get to that point. And I suspect that there's a longer history of thinking about who's an appropriate marriage partner and how heredity and succession works within status categories in the Tokugawa era that has to be both drawn on as a resource for thinking about what marriage or intermarriage means in the modern world, but also kind of radically disrupted in order to create new Minzoku ideologies and new meanings of mixing. So I will stop there so we have time for a broader Q&A.